Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. It's kind of building on what Carl and company have done with TeX Live. This is a program that's specific to the Mac, which actually is just a front end for TeX Live Manager. For some reason, Carl thought some people might be interested in hearing about it. Has anybody used the thing?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So a few people have. You can come and throw rocks at me after this or something if you want. I'll talk a little bit about the history of it, the overall goals of the software, what it does, problems I ran into along the way, and some future plans. I think it's possible that someone might do a Windows native GUI for TeX Live Manager at some point, so hopefully there's information that's useful for that. One of many discussions on the MacTech mailing list started by Jerome Lawrence, October 2008, regarding tlmgr and making a Mac native GUI for it. One of the things Mac users like is consistent graphical interfaces, and they tend not to like the command line. And Mac users are also a real pain in the butt. I am one, I know. I've written GUI software for the Mac for years, BibDesk and TeX Live Utility being the main things. And you'll get emails from users saying, you know, at the bottom of your window, that space is supposed to be 24 points, not 22. And I was reading in the human interface guidelines, really? But they do this kind of stuff. So you can imagine the response to the Perl TK graphical interface. And nothing against it, but it's not a Mac native thing. So this is something I started working on a couple months later. And then 6th of December had an alpha release the next day. I think Will Robertson was one of the first guinea pigs for that. And then a beta release a month later to the Mac OS X tech list. And Mac users are kind of funny because a lot of them tend to be compulsive early adopters and they update things. So that's Carl's beta testing pool for everything that goes into TeX Live. So I've already talked about some of the motivations. For doing it, doesn't have all the same widgets that the native Mac interface has. There are a lot of features that aren't necessarily needed every day. But when this came up on the list, I started talking about, well, you know, the output from tlmgr is going to have to be parsed, and it's all just kind of ad hoc. And Carl said, well, we're not going to change it until somebody actually builds something that uses it. So basically, nicely, he said, put up or shut up. So that's why we started on this thing. The goal was to provide only the most common tasks. Initially, it was just focused on updates, and I added a few other things along the way. I want to use TeX Live Manager to do all the heavy lifting and make it do as much of the work as possible, so I'm not reinventing the wheel or trying to grope around in any of the internal data structures that it uses. I just don't want to go down that road. And I don't recommend anyone else do that either. Another goal is to give high-level feedback for errors. So if some operation fails along the way, whether it's an update map or something during an update process, show an alert to the user and tell them what happened. That's probably the most difficult part of this. Also, we don't want to have interaction with the command line interface. Mac users tend to be terminal phobic, except for some of us who kind of live in the command line. And to avoid blocking the GUI, so just have this responsive. That's one of the issues with command line tasks. When you fire off something and it might take a minute to complete, well, do you sit there with a spinning beach ball and wait, or do you run it asynchronously and then set up your architecture to deal with that? So the program I wrote uses model view controller paradigm, which is Apple's way of separating out objects and determining roughly what sort of subclasses get what sort of features. It uses the COCO frameworks. COCO frameworks are pretty good. I mean, I had this working in a day and had a beta version of it in a month that was actually fairly usable. And that was working by myself, evenings, and that sort of thing. It's a single window and window controller. Privileged commands are a tricky part. MacTeX, which Dick is going to talk about, installs everything with admin privileges. So you need root to do updates. Well, there are some issues there when you try and run root processes from a graphical program. You have to spawn a separate subtask with root privileges that then communicates back to the GUI. And I'm using distributed objects, which is a COCO technology for that. It's kind of old, but it still does work. And I'm using the new BSD license. This is sort of an eye chart. I'm not going to spend much time on it. These are each tasks for various operations in there. And each one of these little white boxes is an object. And you can see by the variable name some of the types of state that I have to keep. There are various downloads, lengths of data, other things, names of packages. This is an asynchronous program, so all these things run in a separate thread. And they have callbacks to the GUI thread when they're done, which works pretty well, but adds some additional complications. Very little data sharing, so I avoided a lot of locking. And this is what the main window looks like. There's not much to it, and see, if I get nervous enough and talk fast enough, we'll do a short demo here at the end. Basically, this is just a list of packages that need to be updated. You can see one there that's set to be deleted on the server, and you can sort the columns, do a search up here with the filter box at the top. And as you do an installation or an update, each of those lines vanishes from the table, so you get some idea of progress that's going on. If you double click on a row on the table, you get this little info panel. Some of the information in here comes from the TeX Live database. Some of it comes from TeXDoc. The documentation files over on the left side actually come from TeXDoc, if I remember right. And the bottom part just shows the guts of it according to what's in the TeX Live database. That's not useful to most people, but I needed it for something, so I put it in. Next tab over, if you see the tabs below the toolbar there, is a listing of all packages that are installed. So you can search that, you can get info on any of them. The next tab over to the right shows you backups. TeX Live Manager does automatic backups, and that's a pretty nice feature. And if you're one of those compulsive updater Mac users, I really recommend you leave it on, because it's saved my butt a few times with a very large package that gets updated fairly regularly and once failed badly on me. So that's worth keeping on, and this is just a way to easily restore one of those backups. Originally I had a log window as part of the main window, then I broke it out and hid it because there's a lot of dirty laundry in here, really. It's mainly useful for my debugging. I want to see what tasks are executing, what their status is, and I don't always want users to see that because they tend to overinterpret it. And that leads to email and user support issues. And I'm lazy and I don't like user support. So my entire goal here is to bulletproof everything and hide all the guts so I never have to answer questions about it. And it mostly works. This is a panel I added to manage repositories. And these are CTAN mirrors. I parse the CTAN sites file, which is sort of gruesome. I have a Python script that does that. I mean, not that the file itself is gruesome, but it's not the most elegant thing to read in and split up. I organize them by continents so somebody can look through here. Some people like to set a static mirror, so I let them do that instead of using the multiplexer. When you type in a URL or start typing one in, you get an autocomplete list here of various mirrors, and you can drag and drop or set a default mirror here and drop between your web browser or whatever. So it basically acts like a web browser.
Adam?
Yes, sir.
You go back to, you typed in USA, but I don't see USA in the strings.
Right there.
Ah.
So that'll show you all the USA mirrors.
Gotcha, thanks. I figured that was what's happening. Just couldn't see it.
At least I think that's what's happening. I'd have to go back and look at the code because
It's like a pain.
yeah, some of these things I add, I don't even remember what they do. Other features, so you can configure automatic backups, how many you're going to keep. Infrastructure updates. In the early days of TeX Live Manager, there was an issue whereby it would self-destruct when you told it to update itself. And that caused some consternation for the Mac users and for me. So I think Carl's suggestion was we download the update tlmgr shell script and run that. And that's actually turned out to be a really solid way of doing the updates. So then no matter what gets trashed, you can always run that and get a clean TeX Live Manager install. I've got an automatic update checking feature that just goes out periodically. It's like a cron job. It uses launchd on the Mac, Python script that runs tlmgr, sees if you have updates, and then puts up an alert window or a notification if you're using a new enough version of OS X. One of the tricky things to add was using the OS settings for proxies. That's been a real headache to get the proxy variables out of the system and set those for TeX Live Manager and wget. But that seemed to work fairly well. There's still the occasional odd issue with somebody. And then paper size, and you can use it with obsolete TeX Live, so we'll go out and look at the dead version archive on tug.org. And you can also configure and run the net install. That feature's hidden right now because it's sort of ugly. Just a splattering of various random windows. You can see you set automatic backups. Preferences, you can set the path to it. Automatically enable fonts in home directory. That runs updmap. I don't want to try and explain it because I don't remember how it works. If you want to know about that, talk to Herb Schultz because he can probably explain the problems there. Update map gave us a lot of grief over the years.
All of us.
Yes. So if I talk about update map sys and update map, I'm sure people know what some of those problems are. And running it as root on the Mac and creating a lot of weird situations. Update checking, various features there. A lot of this would not have been possible without help from the TeX Live team. I might make some comments about problems with TeX Live Manager or the infrastructure there, but Carl, Norbert Preining have all been great about helping out and adding features. Norbert added machine readable output for TeX Live Manager, which made parsing the output from it a lot easier. Lets me put up a progress bar and do some other things with it. Offline operation, dump TLBB. some improvements in error handling. And then Manual also added machine readable output from TechDoc, because I'm using that. So people have been great to work with, and that's really, really nice. Problems I ran into with TeX Live Manager. Some of this only applies to legacy versions of it. But along the way, there were some versions of it that didn't check what version was on the server. So when a new TeX Live was released, some pretty interesting things happened. And by interesting things, I mean bad things with broken installations. And that, again, that's one of those things that results in emails to, the clown that wrote this program. And so we added some bulletproofing to check for that. I know. Check for versions separately from TeX Live, so if one of us screws up, the other's there as a backstop. The error codes from TeX Live Manager are largely useless. It's not necessarily TeX Live Manager's fault, because the error codes from update map and God knows what else it runs are also probably largely useless. You just return -1 or something for every error. You know it failed, but you don't know what failed. You don't know why it failed. So that's a problem if you want to provide some useful information to users. That's where they usually end up having to go try and understand all that log output, or email it to me or Herb or somebody on one of the mailing lists to figure out. And just getting the relevant error text out of that is really difficult, because there are hundreds of lines of standard output, standard error. Sometimes things you think would go to standard output go to standard error, vice versa. And it's everybody's plain language idea of what their error means. So trying to parse it, you're just hosed right from the get-go. Another interesting problem that users noticed right when we started working with this, if you do an update list and you're using the multiplexer, which I notice I spelled wrongly here, if you say get the University of Nevada or Nebraska mirror for your update list, it'll give you 10 packages. And then you do your tlmgr update command. Well, that might come back with a mirror from Utah or somewhere else, which has 12 packages because it's more up to date. Or maybe it only has 3 because it hasn't synced up yet. So that's one of the things that I've tried to avoid, and I keep enough state in TeX Live Utility that I can work around that problem by making sure that whatever you use to list updates is what you're going to use to actually run the update. Anybody else writing something like this, probably keep that in mind. Problems with users. Users are just a pain in the butt. And, God love you guys that put all that information out there on Stack Exchange and wherever else about how to set environment variables. But people using environment.plist, which Apple finally killed in 10.6, 10.7, somewhere around there. You could use that to set environment variables globally for everything launched from the graphical interface shell. The problem is any, say, bash RC or something that ran in a terminal would override those variables. So you would have one set for my program, another set for whatever you're running from a terminal window, and debugging that is really not a lot of fun. And the other thing is people would set these once, and then 3 years later have no recollection that they set it, because it was just based on some random email advice from a guy on the internet, and it happened to work at the time. And there are good reasons for those packages and those settings, but personally I wish they would all just die in a fire. Changing path is the worst one. I ran into another one. Somebody had changed tech inputs, I think, and there's a bib inputs also. Basically what I do right now is in my code go through and unset every environment variable that I think looks dodgy. Other people have cleverly installed a different Python in the system Python, and I use Python for a few things. Or they have changed various Python variables. Sage has done some funky stuff along those lines. I think most of that's been resolved, but those sort of one-off modifications by all the clever computer nerds out there can make life hard. Mixing MacTeX with Think, TTEC, Mac ports, that can cause some issues. And I already mentioned some of the update map and font things. The program still has bugs. Excuse me, it's missing features. The only code I have that's bug-free is the code that I've deleted. There's a possible environment problem on Yosemite, but I think that might have resolved itself now. Progress bar appearance is out of date. I apparently need toolbar buttons according to some users, and we're working on that. I originally had toolbar buttons. They were ugly and they were wrong, so I took them out and said, look, use the menus. This is a Mac. Apparently Mac users no longer remember how to use menus. They've been using Microsoft Word for so long that everything needs a button up there.
I think Microsoft Word, 70% of your screen will be buttons and 30% will be your text.
Well, you don't want the content on there because it's ugly and it crashes. So, well,
you've got little buttons which is just with a word in it, right?
at the behest of a user on the MacTeX list, I did add in some buttons. They're large because they're textual, so they're not in the toolbar by default. And that's just my benevolent dictator approach to how I set up the defaults. That is going to change. I got a bug report on someone using a local directory as a repository. Apple has deprecated the function that I'm using to run root commands, so I may have to revisit that, which will involve rewriting all of my subtasks and IPC. I'm really not looking forward to that. So it's about as far back on the back burner as you can get. Another problem is Google no longer allows hosting binaries. So I haven't done any beta updates for a while. I've got to come up with another place to host those. And so those are some of the future plans for it. And this is the net install tab, which I said is hidden by default. In general, showing users something like TecMF sysconfig, TecGr, that's just not going to go well. So it's hidden by default, but it's there in case someone needs to install in their home directory, basically. MacTeX only installs in user local. Some users just don't have admin privileges. I think Los Alamos National Lab is one of those places, so they have to install in their home directory.
You would think Los Alamos people know how to do it from command line.
Yes.
Well, I work for Pacific Northwest National Lab, so don't bait me with comments about Los Alamos. So, Roadblocks to development. It works pretty well as is, so I'm actually not really inclined to screw with it that much. Apple keeps making Xcode worse. MacTeX likes to support ancient versions. Every time I suggest dropping one, there's pushback from people. Oh, still people using 10.6. whatever. And the bottom line is the sole developer of this thing is really lazy and doesn't want to screw with it. Here's some of the lessons learned along the way, and I've already talked about most of these. Fewer features means fewer problems. Make tlmgr do all the work. Be selective with features. Carl was very helpful in that, especially in the early stages. What does this tlmgr generate thing do? Don't touch it. Just forget that it exists. Right on. Never heard of it. And I've already acknowledged Carl and Norbert for their contributions here. Jerome Lawrence was responsible for the icon, and guys on the Mac Tech list for feature ideas, which are mostly good, and a lot of testing and feedback. They're really prompt about that and really conscientious. A few links of interest that I'll just have in there. The home page, I've got a parser in Python for the TeX Live database. We can dump it to an Apple property list XML or SQLite database. Code for reading CTAN sites, same thing, and the update checker, which is actually cross-platform, or should be. Are we about out?
We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Question. I have a user which from time to time needs to install proprietary fonts. Basically put PFP files in some directory and then take from CTAN the support files. Is it possible with the utility or?
Not with this.
No, and you cannot run AppDmap Cs from your utility, only from command line, correct?
Only from command line, yes. It will run UpDmap if it detects map files in your home directory, but that's just part of the update process.
And you don't have plans to edit?
I don't want to make it that general. Like I said, that's where my laziness comes in.
Thank you.
But it would be a huge undertaking to try and add general support for installing stuff from CTAN.
So first, a suggestion and a question. The suggestion is you're creating a GUI to wrap around a bunch of command line stuff, and it would be really maybe helpful both to you and to the user to have just a window that opens that sort of gives an overview of what is the hidden state, what is going on, what is this program is really doing, because
Right here.
I'm just watching this presentation. I'm still confused as to what it does. So that's the suggestion. The second question is what would you advise someone who was writing error messages to do to make your life easier to parse them?
Easiest way would be to have the error exit code map to an actual meaning. So if I get error code -2, I know what that means. The problem there is manifest.
So whatever's
It's just not going to happen.
Whatever's creating this error code is not actually writing what the problem was to the terminal, or?
Oh, no, we do.
Yeah, it does.
But we always exit with, status 1, basically.
Okay, so you get status 1, and then there's somewhere there's a log with an infinite amount of text, and you don't know which one of those.
Right.
lines.
Right.
It might be in standard output, probably in standard error, but which of those lines? Everybody writes their message differently, so I can't write a natural language parser that picks out the errors and gives anything useful.
Humans can't pick out errors.
Any other questions?
So we have the
about-
log file.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.